I've been sitting on my couch here in Old Saybrook, working with families and individuals like you and couples for the last 25 years. And I've watched some really interesting transitions go down over the course of that time. And I wanted to just talk about those a little bit as an introduction. So I watched our technology and our screens become lifestyles for all of us, at the expense of our mental health and our true connection with each other. I've watched expectations of ourselves as parents and teachers and administrators and professionals skyrocket. And similarly with our children, the expectations have become unrealistic in their lives as well. Um, I've I've seen a lot of fear about not being good enough in my practice escalate over the last 25 years. And it's translated into a culture that we're living in where perfectionism and performance is much more important than character. And that's become an issue. And that is really all before the pandemic. And that was pre-pandemic, those transitions that I was noticing in individuals' lives and within families. And then comes the pandemic at a time when actually we were pretty wobbly going into the pandemic. We weren't on solid ground as individuals and communities and in this country. And the pandemic has served as a perfect storm for a collective traumatic experience. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment. I feel very blessed to have been on the emotional front lines during all this time, and I've been learning along with all of you. And at this juncture, I, I've, I've concluded that it has become critical that we all prioritize our mental health and our children's mental health over our performance and over their performance. And in some ways, it's interesting. There have been some good things that have come out of COVID, and we could talk all night about some of those. I just wanted to mention one that I've noticed, and that is that COVID has really stripped us down. It's really taken our collective blindfolds off in a lot of ways, and we're able to see things that we couldn't see before in ourselves and in our children and in our lives. And it's allowed us to feel things that we haven't felt as well. The good news around that is it's really become time for us to do something with the wisdom that we're accumulating over the course of this experience, um, and continue to work on our awareness. And tonight, what I hope to do is to help you along in that manner. We're going to do this talk tonight, which is going to set the stage for next week's talk, which is going to be extremely skill-based. We're going to do a lot of skill-based work next week. This week, you'll also learn some very helpful skills, and we'll talk also about just philosophically what's going on. So specifically, my agenda tonight is to set the stage by briefly discussing the collective experience that we've had. And then we're going to define that experience as a traumatic event in our lives. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Then we're going to touch on the difference between stress and anxiety so that everybody understands how to recognize one over the other. And then we're going to finish with a detailed conversation about resilience, what it actually is. And we're going to talk about what a prototypically resilient individual does when they're in a challenging situation, and the power that acceptance brings to our lives. So, so the first question I want to start with is, why is resilience such a hot topic? And it was a hot topic pre-pandemic, and it's become even hotter now because we've been so challenged in that respect. And the reason that it's such a hot topic is because suffering in general is a human condition. We all do it, and in fact, we're wired for it. So being resilient is how we respond to suffering so that we can both heal from the pain, discover the opportunity, and keep on keeping on. So one of the faulty assumptions that many of us have is that our suffering stems from the events that have occurred to us in the past. And the deeper truth is that our suffering is more closely related to how we deal with the effect of those past events on us in the present. All right, so the events can, let me just clarify that a little more. The events can happen to us, like when we're through the pandemic and we're, 5 years down the road, we'll have that experience and it will be imprinted on our nervous systems. The event itself that happened in the past is not what creates the suffering. What creates the suffering is how we handle it in the present. Okay, so the good news is that we are all built to be extremely resilient species, and we can become more resilient with practice, and you'll learn more about that tonight. So I want to talk specifically about trauma right now and what it is and why I'm using that term to label the experience that we have had through the course of the pandemic. So we become traumatized when our ability to respond to a perceived threat is in some way overwhelmed. So think about the experience that you've had in the pandemic and see if it fits that definition. So did you become traumatized in other words, was your ability to respond to a perceived threat in some way overwhelmed or taken away from you? And the answer to that for all of us is yes, it was. Now, does that mean that everybody experienced what we would classically call trauma during the pandemic? No. But did it set us all up for a traumatic experience? And the answer to that is yes. So what happens is that our body starts to give us messages that things are not okay and it needs our attention. If these messages go unanswered over time, they evolve into symptoms of trauma. And these symptoms are not caused exclusively by trauma. The difference is with trauma, these symptoms do not go away. And that unused energy is that the unused energy aroused when you feel threatened can get frozen in your body. It's stored in your nervous system, and that can cause problems and symptoms many years later. So if you guys think about, hold on just a second, I want to just pull my notes out here. If you think about the experience that you've had over the course of the pandemic, what you've been doing is coping with an unprecedented amount of uncertainty in your everyday lives as well as in your futures. So what is extraordinary about this is that we normally don't feel this way for long periods of time and indefinitely without being able to actually do something about it, to affect change, to take action, or to even effectively employ avoidance or denial, which sound like negative coping skills, but can actually be really helpful in situations that are challenging. But as extraordinary as the situation is, what it has triggered for all of us is ordinary. And that is when we experience uncertainty and risk, and in the face of a lack of control, we feel stress and anxiety. If it's significant enough and potentially chronic, as we've experienced in the pandemic, we can start to talk about that being a traumatic experience. So don't be surprised by anything that you're feeling right now. I actually started to write a list, a year and a half ago of all the different feelings that my clients were talking about having. And I just wanted to read some of these to you that I had heard over and over and over again over the course of the evolution of the pandemic. So emotions like feeling sad, feeling angry, frustrated, unmotivated, overwhelmed, impatient, just feeling lost. Some people were just saying, I just feel lost, powerless, depleted, weird. I had so many clients, and even now as we're starting to sort of step back into our lives, I've had so many clients talk about feeling weird. Um, Finding it hard to focus, being tired, uninspired, feeling detached or numb, just feeling like everything sucks. They're just having a difficult time finding joy in their lives. Tired of making decisions without information that they can depend on. This is a big one, and this is something that continues to be an issue as people are starting to try to decide how much they should go back out into the world, how they should be thinking about the experience that they had, what they should believe. So the exhaustion around making decisions without information that you can depend upon is significant for all of us. So in addition to all these feelings, don't be surprised if they change from moment to moment and day to day. So it's not unusual. One moment you might be feeling okay and kind of hopeful and things are getting better, and the next moment you find yourself feeling somewhat hopeless or somewhat sad, or distracted. So in fact, our feelings have shifted in really interesting ways over the course of the pandemic. So we kind of, in the beginning, we were feeling hopeful and in touch with our collective experience, and we're trying to find the opportunities in the feelings that we were having. I even wrote a blog about this very early in the pandemic, and then very quickly those feelings started to transform into a lot of other much more complex feelings, most of which were a foundation of the fear that we were feeling. So add to this the fact that our coping mechanisms have been taken away from us over the course of the pandemic, and we're just now starting to dabble back into some of those healthy coping mechanisms. And in the face of re-entering after this traumatic experience that we have, we're also seeing an increased level of stress and anxiety. I'm seeing an increased level of stress and anxiety in our children's lives and in our lives as adults, because we're trying to decide how we want to step back into our lives, and how, do we want to go back out and socialize the way that we used to, or experience our lives the way that we used to. And it's a little uncomfortable, and it's also can be extremely exhausting, because we're not used to managing the same levels of stimulation. We're not used to having to tolerate other people the way that we used to pre-pandemic. So when you have experienced trauma, it's not unusual to have a lot of complex emotions that can come up at random times. So when trauma gets stored in the nervous system, it can be triggered by lots of different things that you're not even aware of, and you can be experiencing emotions that are confusing to you. So I wanted to mention that, so that if you're experiencing that in your lives, just know that that is normal. However you are feeling right now is normal. It doesn't mean that it isn't troublesome. It doesn't mean that maybe you need some support. Maybe you need to see a therapist. Maybe you need some medication. But my point is that we have been through a significant experience together, and individually, and within our families, and with our children. And it has overwhelmed us emotionally and practically speaking, and embedded in our nervous systems an energy that we're going to now be responsible for releasing over the course of time. And this talk tonight and next week, next Monday night, are going to give you the tools to help you release some of this energy. Okay. All right. So what do we know a little bit more about trauma? Because I think it's just really important for you to understand more about it, and more about how the body responds in the face of events like this, so that you can normalize what you're experiencing. So what do we know about trauma? Trauma creates a different kind of memory than ordinary events. So trauma is not stored as stories about bad things that have happened to us, but instead by the physical sensations that accompany the intense emotions that are experienced during the trauma itself. Okay, so it's not the story that embeds the trauma. It's actually the physical sensations that are accompanied by these complex emotions. And it's that energy that gets stored in your nervous system. In other words, a traumatic memory is a visual and a sensory experience. It's like an extremely detailed cinematic memory that is very, very difficult to forget. So when someone experiences a trigger for the trauma, the person is pushed back into the trauma virtually and relives the experience as if the trauma is happening at the current moment. All right. I'll give you an example of this. This was years ago. I was doing a presentation. I was on a panel actually, and it was the first time I was talking about my mom committed suicide, and I was talking about that on this panel. And I did just fine when I was having the conversation. After I was done, I found that my teeth started to chatter to the point where I felt like I was going to bite my tongue off. I couldn't say anything, and my entire body started to shake. And that is an example of being in a situation where the trauma, the act of talking about it, actually triggered those physical sensations that got stored when I experienced the emotions of the event. And in that moment, they were coming out. That was not under my control at all. In fact, the rest of the time that I was on the panel, I said very little because I literally was afraid if I talked, I might bite my tongue. So that's an example of how powerful our traumatic memories can be. So the recollection actually fires up your visual cortex in the brain, which is one of your most powerful and larger cortexes, and creates a physiological change in your body. So the vividness of the memory hijacks the brain and prevents the person from being in the present. And it can make them numb, it can make them disassociate from daily life, it can overwhelm them emotionally in a lot of different ways. So their energy is absorbed by keeping their emotions under control during the event at the expense of paying attention to what is happening in the present. Okay, so in a sense, the body, the mind, and the spirit become stuck, and they continue to respond as if they're in clear and present danger, even after that has passed. So as we're starting to move back out into the world, don't be surprised if the way that you respond, and it's going to feel sometimes like it's not under your control, is that you're still in clear and present danger, even though you may not be. Okay. So, okay. So the other thing that the trauma response does is it takes your rational brain offline. And your rational brain is your prefrontal cortex. And that's where you do your logical reasoning and analysis of the outside world. So it's where abstract thought and emotional memory is regulated. And when you're experiencing a traumatic reaction, your prefrontal cortex actually shuts down and your limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, lights up. So what that does is it makes it difficult for you to concentrate and to process and to sometimes just to be rational. So what I'm seeing with a lot of my clients over the course of the pandemic, and also as we're starting to step back out, is some reactivity. And what's happening is they're having that trauma response is coming up, and it's significant enough, floods the prefrontal cortex with stress hormones, particularly dopamine, which shuts their thinking down. And they may end up getting in conflict with their significant other. They may end up having a difficult time at work with coworkers and not being able to regulate what they say or what they do. So if you're feeling or having these kinds of experiences, it's normal under the circumstances. Okay, so these symptoms that I'm talking about are not caused exclusively by trauma, so they can also be caused by anxiety. The difference is that with trauma, these symptoms don't necessarily pass in a quick way, and they tend to settle in and live in our nervous system. So what we're going to find over the course of time, as studies are done about the socio-emotional impact of the pandemic on our children's development and on our development as adults is that it has changed us. It has permanently changed us. And when they can, they're going to be doing functional MRIs and PET scans and CAT scans on our brain. They're going to start looking for structural changes and information processing changes in our brains, because we're going to discover that the brain has changed. This experience has been beyond significant in all of our lives. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all bad, some of these changes, but it is, we are going to continue to see the influence in our lives for quite some time. So in addition to trauma itself, I want to talk about something else. And this is something that is similar. It's called toxic stress. And this is another form of suffering which is closely related to, and perhaps inextricably related to, trauma. And I learned about toxic stress through a documentary that came out about 4 or 5 years ago. It was done by Robert Redford's son, and it was called Resilience: The Biology of Stress and the Science of Hope. I don't know, maybe some of you were able to see it. So see if this doesn't sound familiar to you. So toxic stress is the chronic activation, okay, the chronic activation of a physiological response to stress when no protection or support is in place to counteract it, all right? So chronic activation of that physiological stress response when there's no protection or support in place to counteract it. So what happens is that the brain is exposed over a long period of time to stress hormones, so cortisol and dopamine and norepinephrine, and it wreaks havoc on the brain and the body. And as we see, it actually makes changes. So it's currently being recognized as the largest public health issue, mental and physical, for young, middle-aged, and older individuals. So toxic stress. So now that we've sort of looked at trauma, which is an extreme form of toxic stress over a period of time, and we've looked at toxic stress itself, let's talk a little bit about the difference between stress and anxiety, okay? So, and the reason that we're talking about the difference is because what has happened in our culture, and this was happening pre-pandemic, is that we started to use the word anxiety as a way of defining our stress experiences. And in doing that, we taught our children to do the same. So what we have unwittingly done is we created a climate where feeling stress, calling it anxiety, labels it as something that is bad, something that means that we're not okay. And so it's really important for us, as we're dealing with our traumatic reaction to the experiences that we've had over the pandemic, and the stress, the normal everyday stress, and maybe some chronic stress in our lives. And then in between there, this thing we call anxiety and what that actually is. Okay, so here's how I want you guys to think about it. It's going to be on a continuum. So stress is on one end, and we're going to talk about an anxiety disorder on the other end. So stress is actually a productive response to a situation that is challenging to us. So when we get stressed, we get this burst of dopamine that floods our prefrontal cortex, but it doesn't flood it to the point where our reasoning, our logical mind shuts down. It actually floods it to the point where we're motivated. We're motivated to make changes in our lives. We're motivated to sit down and concentrate on something. We're motivated to identify a problem and address it. So that's stress, and stress is actually a good thing. It's something that our brains are programmed to provide to us in order to get us motivated to engage. As you experience stress in a chronic form, for example, and stress just sort of burns time, over the course of time, you put yourself at greater risk for anxiety. So that's exactly what happened with the pandemic. We started out with high levels of stress. We thought they were going to resolve in a short period of time. They didn't resolve in a short period of time. They became chronic. And that chronic stress and the level of uncertainty came together, created a traumatic experience. And in the process of doing that, put a lot of us at risk for anxiety. So, what we have seen over the course of the pandemic is adults and children alike who might not otherwise struggle with anxiety are struggling with it now. And those individuals who naturally or pre pandemic had reached a level where they had anxiety, they were experiencing anxiety in their lives, continued to experience it. And then often that anxiety was on steroids. So, what's the difference between that stress and anxiety? So, anxiety is different. Anxiety is based on irrational, or it's actually an irrational reaction to a situation. So what happens when you have anxiety is that your prefrontal cortex gets flooded to the point where it shuts down. You're not able to think in logical ways or process information, pay attention, store memories, retrieve memories. And the reaction itself is not consummate with the situation itself. So if you have stress around, let's say, a problem at work that is rational and needs to be taken care of, then we would not call that anxiety. If you are afraid to leave your house and go to work because you're afraid that, let's say, somebody is going to plant a bomb in your office, okay, that could be considered irrational at this juncture. Even though, is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Is it likely? Definitely not. And if you can't leave your house because of that anticipatory stress, that is going to, we're going to start to label that as anxiety as it affects the quality of your life. All right. So think about also anxiety like this. You know, when you go to the county fair and you get some cotton candy, and they take that funnel and they stick it in the machine and they spin it around and you watch it, right? And it collects and it collects and it collects. And pretty soon you've got this big, huge thing of cotton candy. And you always think to yourself, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to eat that, but I'm going to get it anyway. It looks so yummy. And you take it and you start to pick pieces off of it, or you start to bite pieces off of it. And what happens? The minute you touch it and you put it in your mouth, it disappears, right? And that is exactly what happens when you're moving from stress to anxiety. So when you get to anxiety, it's like you're holding on to this big thing of cotton candy, and it looks huge, whatever the situation is that's triggering your anxiety, or if it's coming out of nowhere. It feels really big. It feels like it's going to take you over, and sometimes it does take you over, and you can't function. But the minute that you face it and you push your way through it, it starts to melt away, and you realize that there isn't a lot of substance to it because it's based on irrational thoughts and feelings. So we want to start to distinguish in our lives whether we're experiencing stress, whether we're experiencing a trauma response, which is going to establish itself much like anxiety. And then are we experiencing generalized anxiety as a function of this traumatic experience that's starting to melt into other aspects of our lives and create and actually affect the quality of our lives. So hopefully that's a little helpful for you. I will say, just to take this a step further, we as individuals experience stress differently. And there are variables that can influence how you experience stress. So, for example, your gender, whether or not you're male or female, and I'm going to just speak to those two ways of identifying because we don't have any research related to other identifications and how they process stress. But we do know that men and women, boys and girls, process stress differently. And I'll give you just a little window into that because I think it's fascinating. There's a hormone called oxytocin, and when we get stressed, men and women, we produce this hormone. Women tend to produce this hormone at much higher levels than men do. And this hormone is considered the connection hormone. So what it actually does is it actually encourages the individual to reach out for help, to reach out for conversation, to share how they're feeling. So you know where I'm going with this. By our very natures of being men and women, we are programmed to respond to stress differently. So women, because of the higher levels of oxytocin, have a tendency to reach out when they're experiencing moderate levels of stress. And men tend to actually go in. They tend not to want to talk about things. They tend to actually deny that they're experiencing the stress. And if they're aware of it, they're going to take it away from their everyday life and try to solve it themselves. And that's just a generalization. Obviously, there's going to be some differences, some individual differences there. So there are some differences in how men and women respond to stress. Believe it or not, extreme levels of stress that are transforming into anxiety. What happens with women, girls, is that they tend to go in, and extreme levels, boys and men tend to actually go out. So you're going to see reactivity with men when they're experiencing an enormous amount of stress, and that reactivity is going to come out. Often it comes out as anger or aggression, and there are many other ways that it could come out as well. So many of the boys that I get in my practice that have been thought to have anger issues, behavioral issues, what we find over time is that they actually have an anxiety disorder, and it's coming out as aggression. And so once we cope with the anxiety and treat the anxiety, we see those behaviors recede. The same is true for men as well. So differences based on gender, differences based on genetics, so you can be predisposed. So for example, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, can be an inherited disorder. Also temperament, which is also inherited, can put you at risk for not being able to manage your stress well. Intergenerational transfer, so if you have parents that had anxiety or that were depressed, they may actually unwittingly pass that down by the way that they spoke with you, the way that they dealt with situations over the course of your upbringing. So, okay, and there are others as well that we're just going to pass over for now. So what happens to the brain on stress? So our brain likes to have a baseline level of these hormones, and as I said, they get on steroids when we're stressed. When they're not excessive, they actually help us, and when they are excessive, they can shut us down. Okay. All right. Okay. So here is the good news. And there's lots of good news. So we're going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about the good news. And then we're going to open it up and have some conversation and some questions and answers. So the good news is that there is something that protects all of us from the insidious effects of trauma and toxic stress and anxiety. And it's not a pill. It's called resilience. So the premise behind resilience is that what you think, your attitude, and the choices that you make, regardless of your life circumstances and your experiences, strongly influence your physical and mental health and ultimately determine the quality of your life. All right? So what you think, your attitude, the choices you make, regardless of the situation that you're in, can have more than a significant influence ultimately on your overall wellness and your quality of life. So what we're really talking about here is the power of that mind-body connection, okay? The power of that mind-body connection. So like Henry Ford said, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're always right, all right? So the secret for all of you at this juncture, as depleted as we all are, you are made to be resilient. And you can access that resilience at this juncture. This has been, and we're going to talk about, I'm going to define it specifically for you. And there's two different types. And we've been kind of stuck in one type of resilience, which has depleted all of us. And that's me included. I have to, I'm right in there with the rest of you. This has been an incredibly challenging time. So in very general terms, resilience is a psychic robustness against loss, pain, disappointment, trauma. All right. It's a robustness in the face of these things that can happen to us in our lives. So in other words, your ability to thrive and adapt and cope despite stressful and traumatic times. So it comes in two very general forms. One form is called recovery or homeostasis. So this is how well you bounce back and recover fully from a challenge. So the speed and the thoroughness with which you actually bounce back. We have not had the chance to bounce back from the pandemic. And instead, what we've been doing is what the second definition of resilience is, and that is called sustainability or reserve capacity. So this is the capacity to continue forward in the face of adversity. So how well do you sustain your health, your physical health and your psychological well-being in the face of stress, chronic stress, trauma, etc. All right, so this is all what we've been trying to do because we haven't been able to bounce back. All we've been able to do is to try desperately to sustain ourselves and to find that reserve capacity in the face of being or having our coping mechanisms shut down and being in large part completely out of control in terms of what's happening to us. So this is a beyond challenging formula that we've been dealing with, and it's why you're experiencing the emotions and the feelings that you are, and why stepping back in and trying to find that recovery, that homeostasis, is going to be maybe a little challenging because you're just feeling like, ugh, I don't know. I don't know if I can do it. I think I'm just going to narrow my life down, keep it small, and maybe that's where I need to be because it's overwhelmed all of us to that point. All right, so sustaining is the amount of stress a person can endure without fundamentally changing. Without a fundamental change in the capacity to pursue things that give life meaning. So that's what we've been desperately trying to do over the course of the pandemic. So having resilience depends on multiple factors. And here's what's cool about this. All these factors are modifiable, which means that resilience is a choice. It's a skill, or more accurately, a bunch of choices and a bunch of skills that will ultimately determine the quality of your life and the amount that you suffer over the course of these difficult experiences. So I want to just tell you a quick story. You may have heard it because this is a story I tell in quite a few of my talks, but I just absolutely think it's so powerful. There was this guy, Travis Roy. He just passed away. I think it was last year or the year before. I think it was in 2020 he passed away. He spent his entire childhood wanting to play ice hockey for Boston University, and his dream came true. He got to BU, he got on the team. He was a freshman. They put him on the ice his very first time playing with the team, and literally in 12 seconds, he got hit up against the boards and paralyzed from the neck down. And I was so fortunate enough to have seen him speak at Conn College about his experience. And he said so many powerful and empowering sorts of things, but there was something in particular that stuck with me. He said, sometimes you pick your challenges and sometimes they pick you. And it doesn't matter because you always have a choice. And none of us picked, for obvious reasons, this experience that has taken us down as a country, as a world, as a culture. And yet no one can take our power of choice away. And it's something that is so empowering to get in touch with. And as a resilient individual, you are going to, in order to get back to baseline and in order to sustain yourself in the face of challenging times, you have to take grand responsibility for the choices that you make in your life. Okay. Okay. All right, so what I'd like to do now is to paint the picture of a prototypically resilient person. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to teach you what kind of characteristics determine resilience, and you're going to learn a lot about yourself. So if you have a piece of paper and a pencil handy, you might want to jot some of these down so that you can go back and evaluate them for yourself. See how you're doing in these categories and perhaps how you might want to make some modifications in your life. Before we get into that, I'm going to read something to you that I found. I just think it's just so incredible. It's actually a poem that was written by an 11th grader during the pandemic. And it is an example of the power of resilience just through the use of words. So here's the poem. I'm going to read it to you one way first, and then I'm going to read it to you another way, and you'll know what I'm talking about. It's called The Worst Day Ever. Today was the absolute worst day ever, and don't try to convince me that there's something good in every day. Because when you take a closer look, this world is a pretty evil place. Even if some goodness does shine through once in a while, satisfaction and happiness don't last. And it's not true that it's all in the mind and the heart, because true happiness can be attained only if one's surroundings are good. It's not that good exists. I'm sure it's not true that good exists. I'm sure you can agree that the reality creates my attitude. So let me read that to you again. It's not true that good exists. I'm sure you can agree that the reality creates my attitude. It's all beyond my control. And you'll never in a million years hear me say, today was a very good day. All right, so she wrote this poem so that you could read it that way, but you could always also read it backwards. So now I'm going to read it to you backwards, and you're going to hear the difference. Today was a very good day, and you'll never in a million years hear me say, it's all beyond my control. My attitude creates the reality. I'm sure you can agree that it's not true that goodness exists only if one's surroundings are good. True happiness can be attained because it's all in the mind and the heart. And it's not true that satisfaction and happiness don't last. Some goodness does shine through once in a while, even if this world is a pretty evil place, because when you take a closer look, there's something good in every day. And don't try to convince me that today was the absolute worst day ever. I'm just going to I'm feeling a little emotional as I'm reading that to you because we need this. This little 11th grader just nailed it. And we all need to find our hope again. Okay, sorry. I didn't think that was going to happen. Okay, so now that I can't see what my notes say, we're going to talk about now that prototypically resilient person. And I'm going to present to you characteristics of a prototypically resilient person with the intention of you hearing what those characteristics are, so that, and it's those characteristics that are going to get you to a place where you're going to read that poem backwards instead of forwards every day. So, what being resilient comes down to is it comes down to coping strategies. And coping strategies like your thoughts and your behaviors, the thoughts and behaviors that you use to manage the internal and the external demands of stressful situations in order to protect yourself from psychological harm. Okay? So now this is prototypical. So we're looking kind of like at the perfect resilient person. So the perfect resilient person is going to know themselves. They're going to know what their strengths and weaknesses are. They're going to know that they have self-worth and that they have self-respect. They're going to be able to accept that sometimes they can do things about situations and sometimes they can't. And when they can't, they learn to let go of those situations. Specifically, resilient people have more of what we call an internal locus of control. And what that means is that they feel like no matter what happens to me, I can figure it out. I'm going to be okay. I can handle it. When you have an external locus of control, it feels like you're a victim. So we have all experienced our external locus of control over the course of the pandemic, because in large respect, these things were happening to us. And we were in a situation where we had to then react to something that we didn't have control over. That is really, to the extreme degree that we have experienced our external locus of control, is not normal for us in our everyday lives. Most of the time, we can work from more of an internal locus of control. So let me give you an example. If you're starting to frame, and this is something that we all are starting to do right now. We haven't been able to tell the story of the pandemic until this juncture. And as we start to tell the story to ourselves and to others and talk about our experiences, we're building a frame around that experience. And we can build a frame based on an external locus of control or an internal locus of control. And it's going to make a difference in how we feel and how resilient we are as we start to push back out and try to find our baseline. So framing our experience with an external locus of control is going to sound something like this. This has been a traumatic experience in my life. It's devastated me and my family in a million different ways. I'm angry at the world. I'm angry at our government. I'm angry at a bunch of people online. The whole world is falling apart. It's mass chaos. I feel at risk. I don't think I'm okay. There's nothing I can do about it, etc., etc. So when you hear that, you hear a lot of powerlessness. You hear a lot of hopelessness. You hear a lot of fear. Fear that that individual is not going to be okay. And the only thing that's going to make them okay is if everything outside of themselves changes. Well, we don't have control over that. And the changes are going to come slowly and gradually, and we're never going to be the same. So to hold on to and maintain that frame is to set yourself up for trauma responses in your life, for potentially for ongoing anxiety and chronic stress, for feelings of hopelessness, maybe evolving into depression. If we hold on to that perspective of things as we're trying to find our baseline again or a new baseline, we're going to make our suffering even greater. So, what does it sound like to have an internal locus of control frame around our experience? It sounds something like this. This has been unprecedentedly difficult in my life, and I've had moments of feeling like a victim and being really afraid of how this is all going to turn out and what it's doing to all of us. So much of this I don't have control over. But what I do have control over is whether or not I feel like I can handle it. And I can handle it because I am handling it. And we all are handling it, by the way. It just isn't pretty sometimes, and it's not easy. And we don't know where it's taking us because we're in uncharted territory. So, it is having an internal locus of control is a belief system. It's a confidence. It's a faith in yourself and in mankind that we are going to get through this and we're going to figure this out in ways that we never even thought of or anticipated. Some of it is going to result in things getting better. Some of it is going to result in new challenges. And that's always the case. So that dialogue, if you listen carefully to that, it feels totally differently. It feels like, okay, I can live with that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start focusing on what my needs are, what my wants are, what my values are. And I'm going to get back to controlling the things that I can affect in my life. Even if they're just a small little handful of things, I'm going to pay attention to that every day and feel good about that. So that's what an internal locus of control sounds like. And we want to teach our children that too, because that gives you the power. It feeds your resilience. It feeds your resilience in amazing ways throughout the course of your life, regardless of what comes at you. All right. And in some cases, if some events in your lives are traumatic enough to actually cause you to feel like maybe you can't live another day, having an internal locus of control can save your life. So that is something that resilient people work on. Now, these are not dichotomous. It doesn't mean that you always should have an internal locus of control and never have an external locus of control. You got to think about these things on a continuum. So you want to always be more on the side of the internal locus of control. Sometimes it's totally appropriate to feel like you don't have control and to let that affect how you, the choices you make and how you feel in the moment. You just always want to process through that and get back to that more internal locus of control and remember that we're all going to be okay. We just don't know what that looks like. Okay. All right. So people that are resilient have a strong set of values and they do their best to live by those values. So if you haven't done the exercise that I often recommend, do it. Sit down, get a list of values and decide what your top 5 are and define them, write them out. What does it mean to have integrity? What does it mean to be, for trust to be important to you? And use those as a filter every day for the choices that you make, the decisions that you make, the problems that you solve, your interaction with others. Because the other thing that helps to ground us during times like this are fundamental things like that, because they bring that internal locus of control out. So if you feel like you know what your values are and you're living based on your values, even if it's in this small little box of your home, you're going to feel like you're in more control than you would if you didn't. So take the time to define those for yourself, and they will be your guiding lights as you start to come out of this experience. Um, okay, so people that are resilient, they put a lot of emphasis on social connection, and even if they're introverts, okay, you don't have to be an extrovert. You can still just have one or two friends and really gravitate to them. The reason being that to be resilient is to have a really good sense of connection and support system in your life. This doesn't happen the way we need it to through social media and online. That is not real connection. I will never agree that that is real connection. And unfortunately, with the pandemic, one of the things that has been the most difficult for all of us is the fact that we have gotten so isolated, and we're not connecting eyeball to eyeball, elbow to elbow, and that is what true connection is, and that feeds our resilience. So as you start to have opportunities to get out of your comfort zone and start to interact with other individuals, I strongly encourage you to do that and get back out to building that physical and intimate connection with the human race. Okay, a few other things. I just want to check my time. Um, I will finish up here in about 5 minutes, okay? So the other thing that people that are resilient do is they work on setting realistic expectations of themselves and of life. So they set their expectations based on knowledge, based on context, and based on reality. Okay, knowledge, context, and reality. Research shows unequivocally that lowering our expectations actually contributes to our happiness, and it contributes to our doing better. Okay, so that sounds counterintuitive. When I talk about this in relation to parenting and kids, parents are like, oh my God, I can't lower expectations. But one of the things that I am seeing is that as our children are moving back out into their world, they're facing expectations again that they may not have had to face during the pandemic, because expectations were lowered during the pandemic, and now the expectations are back on steroids again, and we're seeing these kids struggle even more than they did during the heart of the pandemic. So, and I would suggest that we're seeing the same thing with the adults out there as well. So here's what you want to have right now. You want to have what I call a 70% rule. And this is how it works. You want to focus on, first of all, I said early in the talk, focus on mental health and wellness over performance. And this is one of the ways that you can do this. It's called satisficing. And all that means is that you decide to do good enough. It's not necessarily your best all the time. Sometimes it's just going to be good enough. And with the 70% rule, it works like this. You have a task that you need to get done, and you decide that you're going to do it to your 70%. So you're going to decide what 70% is, and you're simply going to do it to 70%, and then you're going to stop. Just stop at that point in time. You're not going to try to do 100%, try to be perfect, try to be good enough. You're just going to do 70%, whatever that means to you. So why? Why would you use this rule to determine your level of engagement or performance? And there are 4 reasons why, and this is 4 reasons why you want to teach your kids that this is okay to do as well. The first is that when you just settle your mind around the fact that you get to just do 70%, it helps you get started. So for example, maybe you're going to go to a social event and your tendency is like, well, I don't know, I'm tired, it's got so much effort, I gotta go have conversation, and I don't know, I don't really feel like it. And you're putting expectations on yourself. You're thinking, oh, I've got to go, I have to, I have to be happy, I don't feel happy, I have to be the life of the party, I have to talk about, But if you say to yourself, you know what, I'm just going to go and be 70%. And 70% for me is that I'm going to have a few laughs and, I'm going to interact with a few people and I'm going to stay for a half hour, 45 minutes, and then I'm going to go home. And that's it. That's good enough. So what that does psychologically is it gets you started. It actually encourages you to get started. So it lowers the barrier to entry. It makes getting into the situation or solving the problem or the activity you have to accomplish makes it easier. Okay. So it all of a sudden starts to feel possible when you lower your expectations. It also combats what we call the law of diminishing return. So what that means is at some point in our effort to do well, we hit the law of diminishing return where we're not getting that much better. And in fact, maybe we're even performing worse. So if you just decide on that 70%, chances are you're going to be able to avoid that line of the law of diminishing return. It also helps you finish because you've decided when you're going to be done. When you hit that 70%, that's it. Okay, half hour, I've been here a half hour. I don't want to be here anymore. I've accomplished my goal. I've socialized for a half an hour. Now I'm going to go home. So you actually decide ahead of time where that finish line is, and therefore you can identify it when you get there. And finally, what this does is it allows you to reinforce the truth. Okay. And what I mean by that is not the truth defined by your performance, so judging yourself based on your performance, but the truth defined by what you have decided is going to be okay with you, acceptable for you. And it's going to be a reflection of your grit and your resilience, and also your willingness to acknowledge how you feel and recognize that you have limitations. And those limitations sometimes mean that you just do good enough, and that is just fine. Okay, so that's what resilient people pay attention to that. And they adjust their level of engagement and the energy they put into things based on all of those variables. Okay, all right. So a few other things. Resilient people believe that change is normal, and we've been through a massive amount of change, and we're headed into who knows how long, another very long stretch of change. We're in transition as individuals, as humans, as a country, as a culture, as a world. And that's why everything feels so upside down right now, because it is. It is upside down. Okay, so let me see. I'm just going to see if there's anything else I want to bring out before I. All right, I can cover some of this next week. All right, so the last thing that I want to cover that feeds our grit and our resilience is it's not controversial, but it might be a little uncomfortable. And that is civility and the importance of being civil and how it contributes to our resilience. So we are actually living in uncivil times, and we have been living in uncivil times pre-pandemic as well. And it's breaking down our society and our households and our children and our relationships. And specifically, there's a general disregard for the importance of the greater good. And it's leading to feelings of isolation and loneliness and feelings of anxiety and feeling like we're at risk. And so you can imagine we were experiencing this before the pandemic, and then we actually experienced something that fit the bill in so many ways in terms of causing us to feel isolated, lonely, and at risk. So no wonder we're feeling depleted. So uncivility, is it uncivility or incivility? I'm not sure, is a threat to our grit and resilience because it results in a general disregard for the greater good, which leads us to feeling in these negative ways. So civility is a cultural belief system. So this is what it is. The greater good is ultimately more important than my individual needs and wants. And it's based on expectations, respect, tolerance, acceptance, self-control, regulation, and a willingness or ability to sacrifice for the greater good, to put others before ourselves when it's most difficult to do so. And please don't misinterpret what I'm saying as relating to anything, any opinions I have specifically about what has gone on in the world over the course of the pandemic, because I'm not thinking in those terms. I'm thinking in general terms right now, and the importance of living in a civil society. So here's what it involves. Being civil involves paying attention and listening to other people, putting yourself in other people's shoes, being willing to forgive and apologize. So incredibly important and healing. Taking responsibility for yourself and being careful about assigning blame, being tolerant of others and accepting of differences, and assuming goodwill. So what does that mean? This is so powerful. And if you could exercise this in your life and you could teach your children to do this, you can reduce your suffering no matter what's happening in your life. You can reduce your suffering exponentially. So assuming goodwill is assuming that an individual's intention is good. Now, even if it turns out it wasn't good, it's going into the dialogue, it's going into the relationship, it's going into social media and reading and writing and sharing and all the craziness that's going on there, assuming goodwill, okay? And this was actually taught to me when I was working for a corporation in corporate America many years ago. And we had a leader in the corporation, his name was Dick Earnest, and he was a former fighter pilot, and he was really into the assumption of goodwill, and it just created this incredibly open environment for all of us to make mistakes, to fail, to share ideas, to argue, to have conflict. It was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. And by the way, 2 years after that individual left the organization, it went out of business. Okay, and it felt really good to work for somebody like that, and it felt really good to be myself in that environment. Okay, so when you feel capable, confident, understood, safe, respected, when you ultimately know that you can handle it no matter what it is, you're better equipped to be civil, to put the greater good ahead of your own individual needs, to think of others, to respect others, and to love yourself. Okay, so the last thing that I want to mention is just what are the roots of civility inside ourselves. And these are some more characteristics that relate to being resilient. So here are the roots of civility. Respect yourself, and you're going to be more likely to respect other people. Feel competent, and you're going to be more likely to take time to help others. Believe in your value, and you will more likely believe in the value of others. Be tolerant of your imperfections, and you'll be more tolerant of others. And finally, forgive yourself, and you'll be more likely to forgive others. Okay? So one of the things that you could do is to stay off of social media as much as is humanly possible. I strongly recommend, if you want to build your grit and resilience and conduct yourself in a more civil way in your life, I would suggest that you get rid of the toxicity that infiltrates your life every day, and so much of that is coming over social media. So that could be a powerful change that you could make. So I'm going to stop here.